I once met a lady in Paris who, as soon as we were introduced, asked me to draw a picture of a horse, which I did, somewhat mystified. She then explained that she asked everybody that she met to do this because it was amazing the different ways in which people draw pictures of horses, what part of the horse they choose to draw, some people only drawing the head, some the whole body, what position the horse assumes, and so on. And she had worked out a whole system by which she felt she could judge people by knowing what kind of a horse or portion of a horse they would draw. So I was telling this to another of my friends, and she said, "Oh, I think it's entirely too complicated, drawing horses. What I do is I ask people, 'Who are you?'" She said you'd be astounded the different ways in which this question is answered. One person says, "I'm John Smith of 434 Sycamore Road, Santa Monica." Another says, "I'm a pharmacist's mate on such and such a ship." Another says, "I'm a screenwriter." Another says, "I'm Elvis Presley's maternal grandmother." And she said, the rarest of all is a small group who, when you ask this question, say, "Who am I? My goodness, if I knew that, I would know everything." You will see the connection between this and the title of my talk this morning, because really there are two questions. Who is Ramakrishna, and who was Ramakrishna? Now, it's very easy for me to tell you what many of you, of course, know already very well, who Ramakrishna was. That's to say, who he was as an historical character. But to engage to say who Ramakrishna is, what the full significance of this individual is, that is something which very few people could say. Perhaps nobody could adequately express in words. However, before we go on to these questions, I'm going to say a little bit in general about the background of Sri Ramakrishna. And I'm doing this with some apology to those of you who know quite as much about the subject as I do, or in some cases far more. Because after all, this day which we are celebrating, the birthday of Ramakrishna, is a day on which there may well be many people who have come here perhaps for the first time, or after only perhaps for the third or fourth or fifth time, and who would like to go back to the letter A and start with first principles. And so, with apologies to the rest of you, that's what I'm going to try to do this morning. Now, I think the first thing that has to be said about this subject is that the whole position of a holy man in India and of the Indian approach to religion is a little different from what we have in the West. You see, in India, what is considered basic is the religious experience of an individual, what he finds out for himself. In the West, we live, of course, in the tradition of Christianity, and we are used to thinking that the seat of knowledge is fundamentally in the church, and that the church describes spiritual experience, and that our spiritual experience is within the church, not as outsiders, not as individuals seeking for ourselves. Now, for the same, there's another aspect of the West which is related to that. In the West, we are, of course, predominantly Christian. And that means, in fact, that we think of religion as the cult of Jesus Christ. That's to say, we cannot think of Christianity aside from the worship of this divine figure. But in India, one has to remember, there are a whole number of divine figures who may be the object of a cult of worship. You may worship one rather than another, choosing Krishna, let us say, for your ideal, and worshipping him to the exclusion of, let us say, Kali, the mother of the universe, or some other divine figure. And therefore, in India, it is much easier to see that there are, in fact, two aspects to religion: worship, devotion to a divine figure, and the general philosophical approach to religion. Because, after all, what is religion? It begins, at any rate, with the question, what am I? What is there inside of me, if anything, which is other than my little personal ego, which I know? Now, in order to contact this other thing, this mystery which we sense to be not only within us, but all around us in the universe, we may and probably shall approach it through the path of devotion. That's to say, we say to ourselves, I am quite evidently not godlike. Therefore, in order to find out if there is anything godlike in myself, I will look toward somebody who is evidently godlike. And so I worship a Christ or any other divine figure, and so ennoble myself by dwelling upon what is evidently godlike in somebody outside of myself. But this, of course, although it is the approach for most of us, and perhaps the best, safest, easiest approach, is still not the only approach. And one must remember that there are people whose temperament shuns the idea of devotion as being too emotional, too somehow too involving in the wrong way, and who prefer an approach of intellectual discrimination, of trying to find out what is eternal by rejecting what is temporal and phenomenal. it's sometimes said that the path of discrimination is the path of saying, not this, not this, as we throw aside, one after another, all of the things in life which are not eternal, trying to see what it is that finally remains. And in the same way that the path of devotion is saying this, this, because everywhere we try to see the presence of God around us. Now, of course, in saying all of this, I'm taking a big jump, because the question that first arises is not how do we seek God, but why should we seek God? Is there maybe any necessity to do so? Is there any compulsion? Should one perhaps lead one's life on the surface of appearances and rely on a shot of morphia or good luck to finish you off without too much unpleasantness at the end? Well, now, the Hindus have no hesitation in answering this question because they believe in reincarnation. It's very important to bear this in mind because when discussing the thought processes of a Hindu, because this is something that absolutely follows as a matter of course. They do not believe that death is the end, and that therefore just getting through this life somehow or other is no good whatsoever, because you'll be reborn and confronted with all the same unsolved problems and unfinished business to take care of again under what are probably less suitable, less agreeable circumstances. What the Hindus believe is that we are driven by our desires and compulsions to be born again and again. And they believe that liberation consists in freeing ourselves from the fetters of this desire, this compulsion, and so, as they put it, getting off the wheel of rebirth. Birth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth, round and round. They believe, therefore, that there is, in fact, a very definite reason why one should seek to know God, because in knowing God, one comes to know one's own true nature. And in getting to know one's own true nature, one realizes that one is not John Smith or Mary Brown, but that one is the eternal. In knowing this, the bonds of desire are loosed because one no longer wishes to be reborn in this cycle of individual life, and one is freed and becomes a part of, so to speak, what one always was, that's to say, the eternal. So, the aim of religion in India is absolutely apparent. It is to obtain liberation through knowledge of God. And the way in which God is known is by meditating upon Him, rendering service to Him, which means, of course, rendering service to our fellow human beings and making it a kind of sacramental act, so that although you are working, let us say, in a hospital, you are really rendering the service to God. This distinction is important because if you try to render service only to individuals as individuals, you will find yourself minding very much if they aren't grateful to you, or if they misunderstand your intentions, or if they don't sufficiently reward you for your services. But if you can render the service in a dispassionate manner, then this problem simply doesn't arise, because God is never ungrateful. He never fails to be present. He never in any way disappoints you, since you are offering your service to him. So we find in India that there are these various conceptions of ways in which to know God, often referred to as yogas. There is the yoga of service, the yoga of meditation, and the yoga of discrimination, of which I was speaking a while ago, the discrimination of trying to see always the real and to separate the real from the unreal. Now, of course, the practical test by which you answer the question, is somebody acquiring knowledge of God, is the question of, first, the transformation of this person's character. Is something happening to him? If a person is simply deluding themselves or auto-hypnotizing themselves, then, of course, their character is not in the least bit transformed, and they remain exactly as they were. And what is more, they don't acquire the power of projecting any kind of reassurance, any kind of spiritual force from themselves, which you find in the case of all genuinely spiritual people. The whole atmosphere which they bring with them is in itself conducive to belief. One of the simplest and most fundamental ways in which God is served in India is by means of the mantram. And this is a very important thing to know about, especially in connection with Sri Ramakrishna. Now, when you are initiated by your teacher, he gives you a form of words, of sacred words, which you are to repeat. To repeat as often as possible and on all occasions, either aloud or, if you are among people, within yourself. At first sight, this seems too idiotic even to discuss, that mumbling a lot of words, especially as in our case they're in a foreign language, could possibly do any good to anybody. However, the people who make money by advertising in our culture don't laugh. They know only too well that the mumbling of some equally silly sounding words will end up in your buying a certain breakfast product. And of course it is true that we are perpetually repeating mantrams in our minds of one kind or another. We are muttering to ourselves about our resentments. We're repeating the names of diseases that we fear we have. We're worrying about the Russians. And the Russians, of course, are muttering about us. So, after all, is this concept so silly that by repeating the name of God, you can also produce an effect upon yourself? This is, I hope for most of you, a purely rhetorical question, because, of course, anybody who's done it knows perfectly well that it makes the most tremendous impression upon the mind, and that it is, in fact, perhaps the great rope to which we can all hold firm throughout our day and throughout our lives. Now, there's only one other thing that I wanted to touch on before speaking of Ramakrishna himself, and that is something which it's necessary to refer to, but which for most of us seems so strange that it's almost, it has no relation to our everyday experience whatsoever. And that is the state of Samadhi. Now, the result of prolonged meditation is, of course, that the mind becomes more and more indrawn and concentrated upon its object. And when this process has become very far advanced, a phenomenon takes place which is called in Sanskrit Samadhi, which is a state of identification in which the meditator becomes one with the thing upon which he is meditating. The mind is so completely indrawn that the body itself shows no signs of life, and all outer consciousness is lost. And yet, a person in the state of Samadhi is not unconscious. He is tremendously, powerfully conscious on another plane, and becomes aware of his identity, or near identity, because there are various stages of Samadhi, we are told, with the object that he is meditating on. In other words, if you are meditating upon God, you become aware of that in your nature which is divine. This is, of course, as it were, a kind of paradox, because to say I am God is the most blasphemous remark possible to make, and also the deepest truth. If you say I am God, meaning Christopher Isherwood is God, this is ludicrous. But if you say the real nature which abides behind this appearance in myself is God, this is a statement of the deepest truth, and Samadhi is a state in which this truth is known, and not only temporarily known, but known in such a way that once known, the entire man is transformed by the knowledge. Now, this state is remarkable enough, and we find, of course, records that it occurred in the lives of many of the Christian saints and of saints of all different religions, there being absolutely no difference in this respect. Any one cult of a divine being devotedly followed must lead to the same result, since there is only one truth and many paths to it. And we do find the state of Samadhi occurring in the lives of, as I say, many of the spiritual figures in the different religions. But in the case of Sri Ramakrishna, this state of Samadhi became of almost daily occurrence. And he spent many years of his life in this state. And this is something which is, of course, quite out of the ordinary, even in dealing with figures of this magnitude. It's not necessary for me to dwell at length on the actual life of Sri Ramakrishna, because there are so many books about it. It's exceedingly simple, exceedingly easy to remember in its external events. He was born in 1836 in a small village in Bengal of peasant parents. He lived exactly 50 years, died in 1886, and his whole life was spent in Bengal, with the exception of a couple of not very long pilgrimages. His parents were extremely devout, and the boy seems to have been surrounded, indeed throughout his whole life, by love and by people who appreciated him. He was very charming and lively and amusing, and not at all given to studying, but he always captivated everybody and talked them out of any severity toward him. He was very fond of dressing up, as he loved acting, and was incredibly skillful when he was young as a female impersonator. In those days, they were very strict about purdah, the custom of keeping the ladies of the household in retirement, and so that no outside men ever saw them. And there was one man in the locality who used to boast that nobody had ever seen his womenfolk at all outside of the family. So Ramakrishna, who was then in his early teens, I think, dressed up as a market woman, went around to the house, sold them some things, gossiped with the various women of the household, and the next day stunned this man by describing to him exactly what each of them had been wearing and what they'd said and so forth. And nobody could believe it. He was very mischievous. When he was in his late teens, I think at 17, he went to Calcutta, where his elder brother had a school, a Sanskrit school. But he didn't settle there to learning much. He didn't care for it. And then a very rich lady who lived in the neighborhood, enormously wealthy woman, named Rani Rashmani, decided to build a temple on the river banks to the Mother of the Universe. And Ramakrishna's elder brother was asked to be the priest in this temple, and he took Ramakrishna along to help him. And so it came about that by the time Ramakrishna was 20, he was settled at this place, which is called Dakshinesha, and there he spent almost all of the rest of his life. That's to say, the next 30 years. The Rani was a woman of very determined character. On one occasion, the British were trying to put a tax on the fishermen in the river, so she bought all of the fishing rights, hung chains across the river, claiming that the traffic disturbed the fishing, and wouldn't let anything operate until the British had taken the tax off. She was always doing things like that. But at the same time, she had the grace to realize what an extraordinary individual Ramakrishna was, and she felt that they were privileged to have him there, and that any eccentricities of his were to be absolutely condoned. This was just as well because Ramakrishna's behavior became progressively stranger and stranger. You see, he really wanted to know God. And even in religious circles, this is very odd and makes for behavior which to outside people appears to be quite insane, because it has a different frame of reference. After all, everybody can understand one wanting money or a position or this or that, because we all want it. But really to know God to the exclusion of everything else and to be frantic about it seemed so odd that many people were seriously concerned about Ramakrishna's sanity at this point. He, seeing as he did the mother of the universe in all things, he, in the very middle of the food offering at the shrine, an extremely sacred moment, he gave the whole offering to a cat which walked into the temple, recognizing the presence of the Godhead in the cat. Well, you can imagine that this would create quite a sensation if it happened in a Western church too. And yet, of course, it was an act which only the very deepest spirituality could conceive. He was also very firm with the Rani, and on one occasion she was meditating beside him at the shrine and started to think about a lawsuit in which she was engaged. Ramakrishna had at that time telepathic powers, and turning to her, he said, "How dare you think such thoughts here," and smacked her. And however, all of this she accepted and realized that they were in the presence of a very, very extraordinary person, a spiritual genius. And it must be said that throughout all of this period, whenever genuine holy men or people of real spiritual attainment met Ramakrishna, they never thought that he was mad. It was only the outside people who thought so. Ramakrishna then went into a period of about 10 years, 12 years to be precise, I think, in which he went through very elaborate spiritual disciplines under the guidance of two teachers. The first was a woman who is usually known simply as the Brahmini, and the second was a man named Totapuri. If you say that took approximately another 10 years, then the last 20 years of his life was the period in which gradually disciples began to come to him. Disciples of the most remarkable kind. There was, for example, this Keshab Sen, who was one of the great religious leaders in India at that time, and was conducting a kind of reformist movement in which he wanted to bring Hinduism more into line with modern times and destroy some of its old usages, which he regarded as abuses, such as the caste system, child marriage, and so on and so forth. And yet this man, who was a man, a genuinely great man in his way, but a man who necessarily was deeply immersed in worldly affairs, he had even been to India and been presented to Queen Victoria, this man Keshab nevertheless recognized the greatness of Ramakrishna and kept constantly coming to see him at the temple at Dakshinesha. Then also there came to him the young men who were later to be his disciples and who were to found the order which exists to this day and of which this center is one of the branches. The two greatest figures were Brahmananda and Vivekananda. Vivekananda came to this country at the end of the last century, and after a very, very successful an impressive series of lectures all over the country, he founded a center in New York, and I think others. I can't remember exactly, but anyway, as the direct result of this, a link was established with the monastery back in Calcutta, so that in due course other groups in other parts of the country sent to this monastery and said, would you please send us a Swami, because we want to form a center and receive teaching. And in this way, as early as 1906, there was a center in San Francisco, and then other centers grew around, and including the one in Los Angeles. And so the movement has steadily spread. But of course, one must remember that what we have here in the States is only numerically a very, very tiny part of the Ramakrishna movement. In India, it's a very big order indeed, with many, many monasteries, not to mention schools, hospitals, and colleges, and centers all over the country. There are very few figures in the whole of religious literature who are so well documented as Ramakrishna. His sayings, his teaching, his whole manner as an individual, everything is conveyed to us in two extraordinary books. One of them is the so-called Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, by a man who signed himself simply as M. Mahendranath. He attended Sri Ramakrishna during his last period when he had a great many disciples and was constantly in conversation with them, being asked questions, giving answers, and wrote down everything that was said on every occasion at which he was present, which makes for a work which is, of course, repetitive, but of absolutely fascinating interest, because you get the whole atmosphere of informality. And what one sees there in the character of Ramakrishna is this amazing simplicity coupled with extraordinary subtlety. He could answer the most complicated questions in a very, very simple way, showing great intellectual grasp, and yet using the language of a peasant with simple images, simple illustrations, as many of Christ's were, of course, based on the life of the countryside, on animals, and on people such as you would meet in a small village. The other book, which is absolutely basic to an understanding of Ramakrishna, and which I think, in a way, is far more wonderful, is a book written by one of his disciples, Swami Saradananda. Saradananda's book is called Ramakrishna, the Great Master. It began just as a series of articles which the Swami, late in life, long after Sri Ramakrishna had passed away, wrote for his disciples. But I think that book conveys, in a way which no other writing does, the extraordinary mixture of homeliness, simplicity, fun, and strangeness about Ramakrishna. Because here we are dealing with something very, very strange. We're in the presence of a tremendous mystery. People at that time who saw him, great sages, people who would correspond in our culture to the most responsible people in the church, except that, of course, in India there is no church in that sense, saw Ramakrishna and expressed it as their considered opinion that he was not a human being, but an incarnation of God. And this was said in a country where such statements are not made lightly, and where they are not made for emotional or dramatic effect, but have a very, very definite significance. When a Hindu talks about a divine incarnation, he means somebody or something which is the actual vehicle by which God himself appears, manifests himself on the earth. Such a being has no past. He is not subject to the wheel of birth and rebirth. He has no karma in this sense. He simply manifests himself to do good to the world. He is, if you like, an expression of the world's need at any particular moment. He manifests himself and gives through himself power, which is then transmitted and gradually begins to work within society. Now, of course, it's so impossible for us to realize the scope and extent and nature of spiritual power. We think of power in terms of building up something, a big organization, something of this sort. Whereas, of course, the organization, although it inevitably occurs, is really just a byproduct and has nothing whatever to do with the matter. What the power of a figure like Ramakrishna consists in is this, that he could really, by his touch, by his physical touch, communicate spiritual knowledge to the people around him. And when he was dying, when he was in a condition, he had a throat cancer, when he was in a condition in which most people would be scarcely conscious and would be certainly obsessed by their own sufferings. At this very moment, he blessed the people around him so that they went into ecstasy. And at this very moment, he finally declared himself and said, yes, he who was Rama and he who was Krishna is present here in this body. You find a rather parallel situation in the Christian story when Christ, in agony, bleeding on the cross, turns to the thief and says, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. He there was in the same way announcing his non-human quality, announcing that he was a son of God. And this surely is what really matters. Nothing else does. I'm told that nowadays the room where Ramakrishna lived at Dakshinesha is well kept, and you can go there and pay homage. But I rather like a story, accurate or not, which a traveler tells in a book I was reading the other day, of going to Dakshinesha, I suppose in the early 1920s, at a time when the temple was deserted, when Ramakrishna's room was littered and untidy and uncared for, and the whole place was in a terrible state. And this traveler claims that he spoke to a monk who was around the place and said, how can you keep the master's dwelling place in such bad condition? And the monk said, the master isn't here. He's over there, the monk said, on the other side of the river at the monastery. That's where he's alive. That's where you'll find him. Which brings us to the thought that Ramakrishna can be every bit as much alive right here as he is over in India, or as he is in connection with the memorials of his life on earth. It's a very staggering thought to think that if Ramakrishna was truly a divine incarnation, then we here are in the position of having as our teacher a man who was the disciple of one of his closest disciples. This is as though, in the Christian tradition, we could meet somebody who knew one of the apostles. And Brahmananda, who was the teacher of our Swami Prabhavananda, was in fact the disciple whom Ramakrishna regarded as his own son. So aren't we here near to the fountain? Aren't we near to a tremendous spiritual force? And aren't we incredibly, I won't say lucky because nothing happens by accident, but aren't we incredibly blessed to have this contact, however slight it may seem to be to us now at this moment. I think that's the thought that we should dwell on this day, Ramakrishna's birthday.